I know we're facing a climate crisis, and it means that I have made decisions at this age, 26, about the rest of my life. I feel forced to make those decisions, such as not having a child, and also questioning whether university stands as a thing that I need to do. Everything has been called into question because of the uncertainty of the future.
Tonight we're talking about the climate catastrophe and what can be done to stop it. Can it be stopped within capitalism? Are direct actions, local campaigns the way to go about it? Do we need a global solution, an anti-capitalist solution, or do we need both? And how can we do this? We've chosen this rather dramatic clip at the beginning of a 26-year-old woman who, doesn't want to have children. I think that encapsulates really how a lot of people feel in the face of the climate catastrophe, absolutely powerless and somewhat to blame, perhaps. And I think that reflects a misconception, actually, that people are the problem and not the solution. And I think mainstream green politics tends to focus on this individual restrictions instead of collective solutions, emphasizing a local outlook over an international outlook. Often their analysis is based on moralism instead of an idea of socialism and going forward. And I think that also applies to green thought, the Green Party, perhaps coming from Germany. The German Greens are very much part of the establishment. The British Greens, interestingly, I'm not sure many people know this, until very recently they had a program that wanted to reduce the population in Britain to 20 million. By reducing birth rates, but also by reducing immigration. Quite a reactionary program, actually. The Green, this kind of Malthusianism is not quite that pronounced anymore, but it's still quite a program that is very limited and in terms of touching on capitalism. But it's still quite a lot of people think the Greens are the best party to take on the climate catastrophe. Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, the Greens did pretty well in the local elections, unlike the Labour Party with, whatever they said. So far, from what I've seen, they got 11 extra councillors outside London. And in fact, it looks to me as if the Greens have done pretty well this time as compared to previous elections. Now, whether that means people are actually becoming more aware and more committed to green politics, who knows? And in fact, there's a lot of chatter going on that there will, in the next general election, be a Green MP representing Bristol. So who knows where that whole kind of Green Party politics is going to get us to. And I know that a lot of us feel that the Green Party, as it stands now and as it's represented in Parliament, is problematic because some of the views and the actions of Caroline Lucas. So where do we go with all this? We know that there is a catastrophe going on. We know that this is going to affect our children and grandchildren, and that's what this programme is about. But just a few minutes, Graham Bash is going to talk about the last programme on trans.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Just for the record, you'll never get me voting Green. Our last programme on trans rights produced a strong response. Now, a lot of it was positive, many saying how good it was to have this discussion, but there was criticism too, saying it was wrong to have this or that person on the programme. Now, I want to make my position clear. Some things were said I didn't agree with and to which I had political objection, but that will always be the case. We've never had a programme in which I've agreed with everything, just as there was never an issue of the Briefing magazine where I didn't disagree with something. That was and is our strength, our determination to continue to debate contentious issues. The left has suffered exclusion and no platforming from the right in the last few years, and we need to make absolutely certain we don't introduce those methods into our own practice. I have to say there's a number of good comrades I've worked with closely for years, and yet with whom I have important disagreements on trans rights, on Ukraine, and on other issues. I want to debate with them robustly, sharply if necessary, but not exclude them. And I believe that's the only way we can rebuild a left fit for purpose.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, it was quite a little ride, wasn't it, last week? Not just then, but afterwards. But I think really it encapsulates the attitudes that we have in this programme, which is having discussion about things that we disagree with and trying to discuss them without actually feeling that we have to no platform each other or abuse each other. But we're going to start the programme by looking at direct action. So we're going to have two speakers, both on video. The first one is Rhianne Jones, who's written a book called Paint the Town Red. The interesting thing about her work is that she's really focusing on developing climate awareness and climate action through building up the community. And that's where her basis is. And then we also have John Bellamy Foster, Professor of Sociology, who I actually have found fascinating because he's talking about Marx and ecology. And it's something I certainly didn't know about. So let's have a look at those two.
The term community wealth building itself comes from the US, from a group called the Democracy Collaborative. It's a way of reshaping a local economy so that it's collaborative, sustainable and democratically controlled. What it offers an alternative to is the current status quo, which concentrates on economic development through things like privatization, outsourcing, giving tax incentives to multinational property developers, etc. And it often takes money out of an area if these companies are headquartered outside the area in London or outside the UK. In a nutshell, it involves councils using their own procurement budgets, but also working with local public institutions, which are called anchor institutions, things like hospitals, universities, colleges, which also have large procurement budgets away from large multinational companies so that the money stays within the local economy. And that's how it's taken shape in places like Preston, Salford. In particular, there's been a big focus on bringing council services back in-house, and that involves councils to offer better wages and better conditions, and also to be more democratically accountable. Like if it's your council that's running your local bin service or something, or fixing the street lights, it's much easier and more transparent to know where to complain to or what the accountability process is than if it's a sort of faceless external agency. Participatory budgeting has been tried in some London boroughs and places in Glasgow. That's opening up the process of spending and budget setting from being decided like within a council chamber to the local community. First of all, demystifies how governing happens, how decisions are made that affect people's everyday life. So it increases transparency and accountability again. But also it makes spending a lot more effective if you're taking your cue from the people in your community. In 2011, the Localism Act, which extraordinarily was passed by a Conservative government, but that gives communities the legal right to buy and manage local assets, so local land and buildings, through what's called a community asset transfer. And we've seen loads of examples of communities who've taken over the management of local buildings. This includes like empty shop fronts, disused pubs, school playing fields, and public land as well. And they've managed to give these places new leases of life. The Isle of Egg in the Hebrides has almost become entirely standalone in terms of renewable energy. And they did that through purchasing the island itself from its owner. They were then able to set up an electricity company that's owned and managed by the community, and have managed to do things like retrofit homes on the island to make them more energy efficient. And they done things like install solar panels and wind turbines. I think we're at a really interesting point at the moment because that previously it seemed like almost a zero-sum game between trade union interests, let's say, and environmentalist interests. There seemed to be always a battle between those two, even though ostensibly the both of them are sort of progressive forces, and both are sort of opposed to a capitalist status quo. I would say one really significant development is how Green New Deal initiatives have been taking place, and they often show how to sort of safeguard jobs as well as address climate change. In Coventry at the moment, there are trade union shop stewards from Rolls-Royce working with local environmentalists on conversion plans for low carbon economies. Those sort of things are being talked about. Things like community decision making. It goes back to like the Paris Commune. That was one of the first examples in practice of that being done. Public symposia, that goes back to ancient Greece. Like the idea of communities making their own decisions democratically is really ancient. It's just got kind of lost and overcomplicated. And things like municipal socialism, for example, were happening in this country in the late 1800s, places like Birmingham, with a municipality, like a local authority, being able to control things like local utilities, gas and water, things outside local authorities, and things like worker ownership. That's been a cornerstone of like the cooperative movement in this country and outside. And even things like, I think in the book, I bring up The Miner's Next Step, which was a pamphlet published in 1912 by a group of Welsh miners who were anarcho-syndicalists, basically. And they were looking at ideas of worker ownership as distinct from mining industry that was nationally controlled. So even nationalisation, you know, they were sort of looking at being a bit more progressive, as we'd call it, and actually bringing ownership and decision-making down to the level of a workplace. And then there's things like Lucas Aerospace in the 1970s. The workers there responded to threats of closure by seeing if they could change the way that they worked and the products that they made. And that's, I mean, Lucas Aerospace in particular is something that I think is quite relevant today and quite prescient when we're thinking about things like climate change and just transitions. So these are things that have been discussed and implemented like throughout the 20th century. It's not really a new thing at all. I think it's just kind of picking up steam because it's been rebranded in a certain way in the past 10 years through things like Preston, but they're all things that have a really long history.
In terms of Extinction Rebellion, the problem is that they've kind of drawn a line at the critique of capitalism. And we're in a very serious place now. And without a critique of capitalism, you've basically disarmed yourself. Therefore, we won't win, right? We need to have that deeper analysis. We need a more socialist environmental movement, but we need direct action. And we need to combine our forces and our analysis. There's all sorts of development of eco-socialist degrowth analysis now, which is very important. People like Jason Hickel and Michael Levy. There's an organization, Science Rebellion, that branches off from Extinction Rebellion. They're involved in direct action, but they're also critical of capitalism because they're scientists, and they, rather than the view of Extinction Rebellion, which sort of draws a line there, the scientists have to get to the root of what is going on. In August, they leaked the summary of policymakers of the 6th annual assessment of the IPCC, which wasn't published until April 4th, right? But the scientists' report came out in August, and they leaked it because they knew the governments were going to come in and censor the scientists' report. So now we can see both side by side. The scientist summary for policymakers is directly critical of capitalism, emphasizes degrowth, low energy solutions, social changes in social relations, accelerated transformation. All of that got removed by governments before they published it. The rest of the report was done by scientists and isn't touched, but people only read the summary of policymakers, and that got censored in every line in the report. So it's completely rewritten from what the scientists said. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, when he said the latest summary of policymakers was a litany of lies, he was recognizing that they had completely rewritten the summary of policymakers. The scientists now are very aware of the structural problems, and exactly in the terms that eco-socialists are arguing based on analysis that's rooted in Marx's conceptions. When scientists start taking direct action and putting their lives on the line and protesting and facing arrest, then that ought to be really big news. That ought to galvanize the rest of us into action. we can't solve the problem by expecting the system to reform itself, which is a very Marxist understanding.
Right, very Marxist understanding. Great.
Right there.
Right there, there it is. And so we're going to be speaking now to James Skeet from Just Stop Oil. James, hi.
Hi, Jackie. Thanks for having me.
Can't see you at the moment. Hold on a minute.
Oh, there he is.
That's great. So I think you were watching the previous two speakers. It strikes me that we've got people who are very concerned about what's happening to the climate, but kind of coming from different directions from it. There's one who's working on a very local level through local authorities and local control of, if you like to say, the means of energy production and conservation. And then you've got the scientist who is saying, yeah, we need direct action, but we also need to have an understanding of an ideology. Where do you think you stand on this, and people like you stand on that kind of thing?
Well, obviously, it's a very complicated issue, and we need a multi-pronged approach. And not everybody is in a position where they can step into civil resistance, but some people are. And obviously, yeah, we need to come at this from every different angle that we can. But I mean, I'm from an organization called Just Stop Oil, where we're basically a coalition of lots of different groups that have coalesced around this idea of stopping any new oil and gas being developed in the North Sea. The government at the moment is plowing ahead with 42 new oil developments, and this is no hyperbole, is completely genocidal, and this is completely in line with what the International Energy Agency is saying and what the UN is saying, that there can be no new investment in fossil fuels as of this year, and they said this last year, if we're serious about tackling the climate crisis. So obviously I'm from a position where we have stepped into direct action, and we are putting our bodies in line and blocking the thing that's killing our kids, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how recently, but you did spend a little bit of time in Belmarsh, I believe. Now, I've worked in prisons, not actually been in prison, so I know that's not an easy take, but how much do you think, because we've all seen, particularly on the mainstream media, supposedly the majority of people getting very angry at people like you. So how do you balance that the fact that you're perhaps alienating a lot of people in terms of what you're doing by direct action?
For sure. I mean, I can certainly appreciate where you're coming from with that, and nobody enjoys interrupting anyone's lives, for sure, but the key thing here is that they're talking about it, and that's the critical thing. It's like, this is not necessarily an exercise in making friends. It's an exercise in forcing the issue into the public consciousness and raising awareness about this generally. And history has shown time and time again that civil resistance is the most effective means of bringing about the kind of societal shift that we need to see in the sort of time frame that we have left. So ultimately, obviously, we need people operating within the current public sphere, political sphere, but we need this sort of radical flank as well. So I would argue that we don't really live in any sort of meaningful democracy at the moment, and given the time that we have left, it's a case of we need to implore people that, if you have the capability of doing so, step into civil resistance if you can. We have Zoom calls running every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday at 7 o'clock. If you fancy joining on juststopoil.org.
Right. Would you actually? That would be great. I think what we should do is put those contacts in at the bottom of the chat, because one thing I wanted to ask you as well is, how do you come to kind of strategic decisions? So how do you decide, this is what we need to do? How is that decision-making process going on?
Well, I mean, I think that obviously the media would probably present us as like just a rabble of people who sort of go into this kind of stuff without really thinking about anything, and that it just seems sort of chaotic. But an awful lot of thought goes into this. I mean, there's people been studying civil resistance for decades that are involved in this, and a lot of it is an exercise in creating a somewhat unpredictable situation where you can get things sort of fly out of it that are somewhat unexpected, and that's the thing that you can mobilize around. Seen sort of it's a case of sort of analyzing history and sort of seeing where things have changed very quickly on the spur of a dime. And we saw this with sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, where just all of a sudden the entire paradigm shifts. And so it's a kind of exercise in sort of creating those situations. And the hope is that that will spur a spark, because ultimately I think we can all tell that things are not right. I mean, if we look outside at the moment, it doesn't take a genius to see the weather patterns are breaking down. Like, we are in a seriously critical situation here where our home is dying. And if we don't do something about it now, we are all going to die and everything that we care about is destroyed. That's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, there have been suggestions, and by the way, I take your point about civil disobedience, particularly as a Black person. You know, there is a huge history of civil disobedience in terms of the politics of racial equality. So I get it totally and exactly. What do you think about the fact that I mean, it seems to me, you tell me different, that there appears to be such a lack of involvement with minority groups in this country in this civil disobedience action?
Yeah, I mean, I wish it wasn't the case, but unfortunately, the reality is the judicial system and stuff is a lot harsher on you know, people from certain ethnic backgrounds than others, and it's very unfortunate. And I do wish there was more sort of representation across the board. Ultimately, it is a position of privilege. I mean, me as sort of a, you know, white sort of, I could present as straight if I wanted to, you know, I'm going to probably be quite differently treated in prison than, say, a 16-year-old Black lad. I mean, I wish it wasn't that way, but that's the reality. I mean, this sort of comes down to we do what we can within the framework of what we've got, and you know, we do a lot to sort of engage people of lots of different communities, and the hope is that we can all sort of find our route, because ultimately it doesn't matter if we're from China, Russia, Ukraine, Swindon. Like, if our food systems break down in the way that they are at the moment, we're all screwed. So
what would you know, going forward? So you're doing this action and that action. What do you want? Do you want more people to do it? What do you want to see happening? Do you want people, you know, lobbying? Because we obviously know that very soon there's going to be huge strictures against protest. I mean, I saw somewhere that people had been put in prison for actually just holding up a poster. They weren't blocking the pathway, they held up a poster. I mean, that's extraordinary. So what's going to be your response to that?
I mean, at the present time, we currently have 14 people in prison. They're political prisoners. They're for peaceful environmental protest. Now, this really reveals where the government's position actually lies. Despite all the proclamations that they said at COP26 about being leaders on climate, they don't give a rat's ass. They have no intention of dealing with this crisis. They are more intent on enriching themselves and their billionaire oil oligarch friends than to ensure a livable future for all of us. So it does present us a bit of a challenge, that the way that the state is sort of making maneuvers to outlaw protest, but it really highlights our efficacy the last couple of years of XR and lots of other different groups and Black Lives Matter, but first they laugh at you and then they fight you and then you win. That's the reality, and we are very much in the fight stage now. The judicial system and the government are not ignorant to what's called the backfiring effect. So when you get the state cracked down on you, 9 times out of 10, it elicits a hostile response in the population, and then people rise up. We saw this with the jailing of the Enslaved Britain 9 towards the back end of last year. On the basis of that, 2,000 people came out and protested, and 124 people broke the very same injunction that sent them to prison. So the government watches this sort of thing, and they aren't stupid. So ultimately, if we do push them into an overreaction, that is actually perhaps a net positive for the overall movement. It's a case of political and moral jujitsu in a certain way, that you push their own overreach against them, if that makes sense.
So is there room for people who don't want to get put into prison to join you and support you? Is there things that people can do?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I did a sort of back of fact packet calculation a while ago, where I think I saw that it takes sort of 9 non-arrestables each per arrest. You know, there's a lot of people in the background, and there's countless ways that people can get involved in movements, you know, be it social media, be it, you know, just looking after people in safe houses and things like that, and just being there and doing talks and things. There's a huge range of ways to get involved. It's just the reality is that all of us, each day, we need to be asking ourselves, what have I done to avert this crisis? And if the answer is nothing, then we need to be questioning that.
That's great, thanks.
I wonder if I could ask you a question, James, before you go. Sorry, the professor, John Foster, he was talking earlier on about how Extinction Rebellion doesn't want to touch the issue of capitalism, I think because they think it alienates people. What's your view on that issue? I mean, do you think it's important to educate people on where this actually comes from, this whole crisis, which would be, you know, my view?
I mean, obviously, I can probably only speak for my own position, but I think it's fundamentally important that people are educated in alternative economic models and understand the processes that have led us to this position. I don't see how we navigate our way out of this without an understanding, and we need to be talking about degrowth. We need to be talking about, just what are the options in terms of how we dig ourselves out of this, because we know fundamentally that we cannot live on a planet of finite resources with an economic system that depends on infinite consumption. The maths just doesn't add up. So we have to be having these conversations.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jane. We've been joined by Jerome Lewis now. I think we're getting into that segment. Jackie, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jerome's here.
Jerome is here.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Jerome. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Very well.
Let me just tell people who don't know who you are, because you're actually a pretty well-known anthropologist, been doing some extraordinary work with hunter-gatherer groups. And obviously, like us all, they're very affected by the climate. In fact, perhaps, you know much better than me, they're probably more aware than we are about what is actually happening with the climate at the moment. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, already in, I think, 2005, some elders came to me when I was visiting and said, you know, you've got to go back and tell those people back in your place to sort things out. The seasons are all over the place. It's raining when it shouldn't be raining, and then when we want it to all get nice and dry, it's getting all muddy again and so on. So it really does affect hunter-gatherers actually more, well, as much as farmers, and perhaps more, because you depend on being in the right place for particular fruit trees, or knowing that this is the season when all the fish will be available in whatever the high streams of the forest and so on. And so those sorts of information are very climate dependent, and if it starts messing up, people's livelihoods start messing up very quickly. So,
okay, you know, from what I know, the hunter-gatherers have been living in their environment for thousands of years. They have what I would think of as probably an economy of plenty. What that means is that they get enough food and enough housing, and, you know, there's no want as such in their societies. How have they managed to live in their environment so successfully? And can you think, is there anything we can learn from them in how they live?
Well, they have a basic principle, which is what underlies all their sort of taboo structure or prohibitions and the rules of their society. And it's basically around how blood is organized. But the key thing is that the women's blood must be kept separate from the blood men spill when they kill animals. And that organizes the gender division of labor. But beyond that, everything that anybody takes from the forest has to be shared equally with all who are present. And if I have something that's more than I can immediately consume, anybody can ask me for it. And it's not my right to say no, it's my obligation to share. And in anthropology, we call this demand sharing, to distinguish it from the sort of donor-orientated sharing that has so much political implication in our own society. And they're constantly seeking to undo any potential for somebody to accumulate things that could lead to them creating dependencies, claiming status, or otherwise instituting hierarchical structures or relationships. So these are in fact what we call egalitarian societies in anthropology. They're societies who've rejected all forms of distinction between people. People are different, of course, but they have all sorts of strategies like plain mockery and teasing, and they're very good at that, for anyone who starts to step up above themselves.
So what happens if somebody transgresses? You know, somebody throws, I don't know, takes more of something and hides it, or wants to use it just for themselves. How is that sorted out?
Well, it becomes an extreme, I mean, these are face-to-face societies, so people are living in camps, generally from about 30 to 80, maybe 100 people for a special occasion. So it's not easy to do things secretly. And one thing you quickly learn when you live with them is nothing is a secret anymore. You don't have any privacy. Not because you don't try, but just because there's always some way someone realizes what's going on when things happen. And so that means that hiding stuff is possible and people do it. But when they get caught, boy, it's a hullabaloo. Everybody's teasing them, laughing at them, joking about them, asking them if they're like the farmers who don't know how to share properly. And they really will get a hard time. And it's not good for your wider appeal and your friendship circles to be a sort of stingy. I mean, I don't know anyone who's stingy in that society. It's like, it's just, it would be constantly being rude and harassed by everybody, and you'd be rejected and sort of just pushed away, shunned.
So it's almost the opposite of the way we live, because the people we admire, and of course this is a generalisation, are the people who can accumulate the most and who can show off their wealth. And you're talking about something extremely different. So if you were going to suggest the ways in which that this society could point towards what we need to change in terms of the way our society runs, what might it be? I know this is a very long answer.
Well, I mean, a proper answer obviously is well beyond my ability, but I mean, taxation is rather like sharing, demand sharing. It's not something you choose or decide upon, and it should be, distributed to all present in measure as they need it, and that's very much like demand sharing. But I'm just astonished here why people are so reluctant to pay taxes. I mean, it gives me pride when I see refugees walking along the high street and they're, feeling at home, they're feeling safe, or whatever it might be. It just, these are things, people being looked after properly in social care or wherever they end up having to be for a part of their life. So those are the things which matter, and not so much money on weapons and war. That would be wonderful.
Wouldn't that be wonderful too? So what do you think about this balance between direct action and community development? What do we need at this point in time? Because we do have a climate catastrophe. I don't know about you, but I'm terrified for my grandchildren. I can't even think about it most of the time because it just makes me terrified.
Yeah, well, I think you're very sensible to be terrified, and the evidence would support your worries. But that doesn't mean that that's the right response. Clearly this is a really serious thing, and there's no getting around that, and I don't mean to belittle it. But at the same time, each of us has a responsibility to be the solution, to be part of the solution. And one of the things that living with hunter-gatherers teaches you is that, well, firstly, you're not the top of the food chain. There are lots of things that are hunting you constantly all the time. So it gives you a good bit of humility as a human to feel that. But then you realize that actually you're not independent of your environment, because as you walk around the forest and you're taking things and eating them, you're growing, and you see your children growing. My son was in the forest for 3 years, and you really see how it is actually landscape transforming into us. The idea that we're somehow independent from this planet, this I-ness, the ego, that's such an obsession and has been just taken into extraordinary proportions by consumer culture, is actually a fallacy. And the reality is that we are interbeing with all sorts of other species, including the bacteria in my microbiome, all the way through to all that surrounds me here in London where I live. And it's that interaction which is life on Earth. And unless we start to really pay attention to that, we're not going to get to the solutions, but each of us can just attend to cultivating diversity. I think that's the core message I've found, which I think is a really helpful way to give people hope. And it produces joy if you actually do it, is to just take whatever space you have influence over and start producing diversity of life in it. And diversity of cultures, because of course, doing things differently is crucial. And it's one of the things that I think sometimes get lost in the way that we organize politics, where we have this single approach that everyone has to adopt. And in fact, for the climate crisis, we need many, many approaches so that we all find different ways of building diversity around us. And in that diversity will thrive the solutions that we need, but without making that major effort, and it is a major effort. But it's one that makes you happy. It gives you joy to watch things grow. It's just a natural, we're hardwired to do that. So anyway, that's the rather optimistic hope, but I do think that we all have a part to play, and feeling a bit too terrified it's important to recognize it, because it is terrifying, and there's no, how much human suffering will we tolerate before we really start to take this seriously? That's my great fear at the moment.
Thank you very much. I really think I think what you said, I found absolutely thrilling. And I think we have to kind of grasp it and take it in, just like oxygen. Is this what you suggested, which is producing joy, that actually changing our lives would actually produce joy. It would make us a happier society to live in. It's not just about, saving the birds and saving the planet, or it's actually about saving the essence of what it means to be alive and what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for reminding us about that. That's great.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
We also want to look at collective measures to overcome climate catastrophe, which has been produced by international capitalism. So we want to look at some of these issues now with Alan Simpson, former Labour MP, who was Green advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. Hi, Alan, welcome. You've actually suggested this program to us, so thank you very much, and thank you for contributing and giving us some ideas of how we could structure it. You're quite a big fan of some of the measures that other countries have taken, the governments, for example, the German government. The British government seems to be more interested at the moment in punishing anybody who does anything about capitalism and the climate catastrophe, or who speaks up and is too loud, etc. Can you outline some of the approaches in other countries that you think are going the right direction? Can you see how would they logically, sort of, in your view, lead to an actual challenging the logic of what capitalism has been doing?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that it's important that the left does is to reflect on our own language, because sometimes I think we get stuck behind slogans, and for a lot of people, even the notion of capitalism just disconnects them from how to do anything that changes their immediate life or the prospects for their kids. So I think we have to find pathways in. And what Jerome was doing was just giving us a lot of examples of how other cultures have been doing that. And I have tried to make a point of looking at how other countries, within the contradictions that we're all having to accept that we live within, how there are examples of beginning to do things differently. And I'm less bothered now about capitalism because I think it is destroying itself. As an MP, I thought it was my job to destroy capitalism, but actually it is destroying itself faster than I could ever have dreamt. So the question then is, what is the alternative that we put in its place? And so I think we need models of the how and where that. And sometimes it's difficult to get beyond our own limitations. When I was advising John and Jeremy, to his credit, John MacDonald, we got the climate physicists in very early on, and John chaired the first couple of meetings of the working group that I set up. The end of the second one, he came out saying, look, as politicians, we're not in the driving seat anymore. Physics is in the driving seat, and economics really just has to catch up if we're to survive. And now I thought that was very brave of him to say that. The difficulty was that John then faced two major obstacles. The first was the resistance within the Treasury, which was full of a conventional free market economists, who are a walking disaster. The second was that almost every big step forward that John tried to take, we had sections of the Labour Party and the Labour movement that were catastrophically opposed to it. So when we talked about car-free cities, and I did a sort of small paper on this, within half an hour, the GMB were on the phone to John demanding that he sack me, because they had a lot of members in the car industry, and we couldn't be talking about restricting the rights of motorists. And John kept having to argue that climate now is the benchmark against which we have to measure and judge everything. In that sense, James is right. We don't have the time to be kidding ourselves that just with a little bit more oil, we can buy a little bit more time and then we'll make the changes. We've run out of that sort of breathing space. So we need to look at completely different economic models. And if I get into trouble now, it's my disagreements with XR are mainly just that I want to move from being oppositionalist to propositionalist. And I think for a lot of people, they're scared to death about the prospects of climate collapse, but they don't know what to do and they don't know which part to play. And so I'm not a critic of the small and the local if it begins from the notion that everything hinges around reclaiming the we from a society that has become obsessed with the me. And so those linkages are part of the process of really building or rebuilding a sense of strength and a collective capacity to change things. And often you're then confronted with huge contradictions. And this brings me to the German example. Germany has got about not far short of 1,000 energy cooperatives. They have decentralized grid systems, which were forced on the German population as a post-war settlement to prevent national rearmament. And what they've done is that they have enabled much greater sense of local responsibility and ownership and accountability. So I'd taken various groups of MPs around different parts of Germany, where their own states have the ability to install solar roofs on everything, local community wind turbines. They can generate electricity at a local level at almost half the cost of grid charges. And fundamentally, the difference is that they can then sell it to themselves at those lower prices, effectively, the wholesale price of electricity rather than the retail price. We take people around knocking on doors in the villages and the towns, asking people, whether they thought the wind turbine was ugly or, whether they just resented the solar panels on roofs and schools. At a community level, people were talking to us about saving the planet. It came down to us to ask them whether the costs and the money made a difference, and they all laughed at that point and said, oh yes, of course it does. We can, it's much better if we know that we're also cutting our energy bills in half. We could do that in the UK, but we're not allowed to. In my own house, I generate a surplus of electricity. I could give it to two of my neighbours. If I gave it to a third, I'd be a criminal, because you can't do that in the UK without having a full supply license. And you only get a full supply license if you can pay for one, which costs you about 3 million quid. And most of us tend not to carry that sort of stuff around in our back pockets. So we are prevented in the UK from doing what they do automatically in Germany and throughout the entirety of Denmark, where actually Denmark has gone further because they redefined the whole of their energy sector as a not-for-profit market. It's a service. And so the companies aren't allowed to sell energy for a profit. And they have the entire country served by a network of energy cooperatives. Now, energy co-ops in the UK, I do a lot of work with them, but they really struggle to survive because they're not allowed to sell to the local community. And we do a lot of work with schools. This National Schools Energy Co-op that I'm involved in, we've just put a roof on Salisbury Cathedral's cloisters. So, I mean, they are incredibly popular. Paradoxically, amongst the hardest places to work with are Labour authorities rather than Conservative ones. And the reason for that seems to be that when you try and take the ideas into the Conservative areas, the first questions you get asked is, how much is this going to cost us? And the answer is nothing. You just need to give the permissions, and then the schools and the communities, we can do the installation as long as we're able to raise the cash as a co-op and then provide the services that will give access to the clean electricity into the locality. At which point, most of the Conservative boroughs say, well, okay, that sounds cool, get on with it. The other side of the coin is often progressive Labour authorities. When faced with the same questions, they come to a very early sticking point and they say, who's going to control this? Oh, no. The council have to control it. And we say, just let the community in and be part of it. It's as a cooperative. No, we'll do it. We either have to do it ourselves or it's not going to happen. So those issues about old style, centralist, controlling, obsessed Labour local authorities actually become part of the problematic. So taking examples from other countries is a really useful way of bringing home to communities that it's possible to do things, and to politicians that actually they and we are part of the obstacles in that pathway rather than part of the solution at the moment.
I mean, this is very interesting. I'm also not opposed to the small and the local, and I think also the speaker earlier from Just Stop Oil put it quite well. Sort of when you need a change in people's minds, first of all, clearly, to believe that there's a solution and it could be different. And then, you spark something locally, perhaps, that can then actually go towards a paradigm shift, a bigger paradigm shift, when quantity turns into quality and you have a sort of, a change in governments, etc. But on the issue of capitalism destroying itself, that kind of leads into that. I mean, it's not going to do it by itself. It could keep going for some time. And the way you just described, there's laws missing, that would allow such things to happen locally. I mean, that has to happen on a sort of bigger level, doesn't it? I mean, that's not just going to happen locally. You need some kind of, a party, a democratic party or something that fights for that. I mean, that's, I presume, why you were also a part of the Labour Party and try to push through the Green New Deal. And how did that go? What kind of problems did you encounter there?
Well, unfortunately, both Jeremy and John got skewered on this because the really radically exciting aspects of the Green New Deal are all rooted as well in the refounding of democracy and accountability. And, energy was a really classic case in point. If you wanted to address it in terms of carbon reductions, for every current power plant, 50% of the energy that is produced is lost at the power station. In the case of nuclear, it's 70% loss. But the mentality works on a power station to plug one-way street. The alternative, which is the model of more interactive, locally accountable, both producers and consumers, can radically reduce your carbon emissions, clean up the energy production process, and push the stronger notions of energy security and pooling and sharing. So we were doing this, and Jeremy and John were really keen on that. But the major trade unions essentially wanted to have centralized control of the energy system and centralized production as well, because that's where the bulk of their members were.
You mean nationalized, or what do you mean by centralized?
They wanted nationalized and they wanted it centralized, so that major production centers were still pivotal to them, because that was where they could recruit their members from, and that was where their leadership could get the votes in leadership elections from. Decentralized systems are much harder for the trade union movements to engage with. But actually, those that are willing to step into that space, I think, are going to be the major beneficiaries of a completely different mindset about collectivism, refounding democracy with more localized and shorter lines of accountability at the center of it. And that will be so whether we're talking about food, whether we're talking about transport, whether we're talking about energy. All of this requires a different mindset about economics. So post-growth economics, and I understand it when people talk about degrowth, but for people who are poor on our street, degrowth as a term scares the living daylights out of them, because most just think they're hanging on by their fingernails to survive in now. So degrowth sounds like making do with even less. So what I tend to talk about instead is we have to move rapidly to the circular economy, where what we do is we pool and pass around in ways that both produce and consume in radically reduced carbon footprints. And there are loads of examples of this in food, with much more localized food systems. The city of Liège, for instance, has created what they call the food land belt, 50 miles around the city. The city has funded the formation of, I think, something in excess of 50 farmers' cooperatives. The plan is that within the next 5 years, they aim to produce 50% of the city's food needs from within that 50-mile radius. And they're doing it by promoting cooperatives that get farmers themselves to cooperate and communities to participate in the food growing and sharing process. In Montreal, they've got another sort of twist. Montreal, my wife comes from Montreal, it's bloody cold in winter, freezing, -20, -30. But their way of reducing food miles is to have started to commandeer the tops of factories and office buildings, put greenhouses on the top of them, take their hot, stale air out, grow hydroponically, and they're currently producing something like 20 to 25,000 shopping trolleys of locally produced food per week for people who live in Montreal, with a 90% plus reduction in the carbon footprints of the food miles that's associated. So, there are really, really exciting examples internationally of people working collaboratively at levels that begin at the local, move to the regional, and actually are shaped around a national plan. But it is living within an annually reducing carbon budget. And the challenge for me, for the left, is to say, are we capable of rethinking our own economics and politics to embrace that sort of thinking and make it attractive to the whole communities that are currently dependent on us on doing something more than being able just to continue to hang on by their fingernails?
I mean, you describe this very well. I think refounding democracy, etc. And notice you don't use the word socialism, which in my view is a positive vision of overcoming this, and has to be local as well, and is not the what happened in the Soviet Union. It's the opposite of what happened in the Soviet Union. Is local empowerment, etc. The problem I can see, apart from the government not actually wanting to empower local communities and doing everything to stop laws like that and prevent people doing that, but of course there's also not all countries have the money, the technology to do all of that. India is one of the biggest polluters. China is one of the biggest polluters. There's nothing like that happening there at all. Can we really solve the climate catastrophe with these sort of local campaigns here in the sort of, westernized capitalism, when other countries like China and India and poorer countries, which will also, produce a lot of pollution, they can't actually do it. How will that work?
Well, at one stage, I did quite a lot of work in India as part of the anti-GM crops movement, and I went to work with a campaign organization called Cremate Monsanto. It sort of is what it says on the tin, really. But they had farmers who were literally burning down Monsanto's fields. And I went something that at one point I remember saying, look, this is amazing, but you lot are really poor, incredibly poor. I couldn't, as someone from the affluent West, I couldn't complain if you just said, well, we just have to get on with it. So how do you explain the burning down the fields? And they said, look, we begin from the notion that those fields, to grow GM crops, we have to surrender our farmers' rights, traditional rights, to save seeds. Monsanto gives us the seeds in advance, but then we have to pay them from the proceeds of the first crops. And then after 2 or 3 years, the crops are less than we were getting of the seeds we saved, but we no longer have those seeds. And actually, the level of farm suicides has skyrocketed as a result of us becoming enslaved to producing for your markets. So actually, we can produce for ourselves if we just have the freedom to do so. And I said, well, what acts of solidarity are useful from the rest of us? And they said, if you refuse to buy, we won't be forced to grow. And in a way, that explanation now also extends to where we are. If you look at the global map of cargo tankers that are stockpiled in the sea around India and around China, in order, waiting for the opportunity to ship cheaply produced goods in the Southern Hemisphere to markets in the Northern Hemisphere that are wanting to buy cheap goods, then actually this is an example of where you make rapid and radical carbon reductions by just ending that approach to globalized economics. It isn't going to work. What needs to happen is we need to be transferring from north to south the opportunities to do things that deliver food security. And in the main, what I found was that people weren't asking for GM crops. They were asking for better facilities to be able to store the food that they produce, so that the third of it that is lost because it can't be stored or transported is able to be stored and transported and shared within their own localities. So that the new internationalism that I think is called for is almost a different, a new visiting of 1945s, of post-war settlements, based around the sharing of cash and resources, and not the model of globalization of markets. That's what is killing us all.
Absolutely. I think new internationalism does sound it up. The people that below the working class, if you will, must get together internationally to take on this system if we want to have a chance of stopping the climate catastrophe. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought that was very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Alan.
Lots of those ideas and examples are in some of the papers that I sent through, and they're on my website. And if I could just finish with one thing that picks up on Jerome's point I was really touched by examples in North American indigenous tribes, the First Nation tribes, and their powwows, their parliaments set a benchmark about how they made decisions, and the great law of peace that they established. The first principle is that all decisions had to be able to ensure that this made it was safe for the next 7 generations. You know, we live in a politics where MPs you're lucky if they can give you a guarantee for the next 7 minutes, but in principle, to reach out and embrace a responsibility for the next 7 generations is probably the one thing that would save us all.
Thank you very much. And it's women who have a lot to say in those powwows.
They do. And in the Iroquois state, the thing that really amazed me, although most of the tribal chiefs are male, on the subject of war, because the nations had never been to war with each other. They've fallen out, you know, as people do. The issue about war is, although the chiefs at the powwow could actually vote that they wanted to go to war, it couldn't become enacted until it had gone back to the villages. And the village voted, but although the men who were the chiefs made that initial recommendation at a village level, only the women had the right to vote. And the women never voted for an outright war amongst the Iroquois tribes. So there's something to be learned there too.
You just need to put the women in charge of the tribes and then all problems solved. Thank you very much for joining us, Alan. Thank you. So that was interesting, wasn't it? Very Iroquois. We also wanted to look a bit more on what Marx had to say on nature, because that is actually wrongly claimed that Marx had nothing to say on the issue of nature and ecology. And he actually, as it turns out, and John Bellamy Foster has written about this a lot, he had quite a lot to say about that and quite revolutionary things. So we interviewed him on this issue a little bit, and then we're going to talk about it briefly. Here we go. You've written a number of books on issues around Marx and his view on ecology, especially one book called Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature. Can you firstly explain what their outlook on this issue was, in particular what you describe as the metabolic rift?
People used to say, well, Marx never said anything about the environment. And I'd say, well, did you read hundreds of pages he wrote on agriculture in Capital? And they said no. Well, how can you know he didn't say anything about the environment if you don't even look at what he wrote? Marx's approach to the environment really comes out of his materialist conception of nature, which is the viewpoint of natural science, really. Marx's original contribution, though, his own contribution was introduce what he called the materialist conception of history to complement the materialist conception of nature. So it's very clear at the beginning of the German ideology with the notion that human beings were corporeal beings, they were physical beings. And then he moved from that to the mode of production, and then the critique of political economy and his larger body of thought. He incorporated the materialist conception of nature in every part of it. That wasn't his specialty, but practically on every page of Capital, there's references to the natural science, the materialist conception of nature, and it's integrated. And what he adopted was the notion of metabolism, which of course was developed by cell biologists in the early 19th century, used widely in science and in thermodynamics, which was appearing at the time, and in the work of Justus von Liebig, the great German agricultural chemist. And Marx introduced the notion of social metabolism, that the labor and production process was the way in which human beings mediated their relations with nature. When capitalist production, because it's an alienated form of production, came into conflict with basically the laws of nature, the universal metabolism of nature, what arose was a metabolic rift between human beings and nature. So out of this, Marx developed an analysis of ecological crisis that was phenomenal and still is phenomenal, because it's the only analysis that links the social and ecological at every point. There is no ecological theory that is as comprehensive in understanding the relationship between the contradictions in the mode of production, both economic and ecological at the same time. The whole notion of the ecosystem and even the earth system are rooted in the concept of metabolism and the way in which Marx developed it.
Did he see that as a coming and going, or was it a different kind of crisis as opposed to the economic crises that they both foresaw?
Both economic and ecological crises were rooted in capitalism, but they occurred in different ways. Capitalism could actually grow and prosper while it was destroying the human relation to the earth. So an ecological crisis could be occurring when an economic crisis wasn't, right? And that's really a fundamental contradiction. He focused a lot on the soil crisis in the 19th century. That what was happening is that the nutrients, the soil nutrients like phosphorus and potassium and nitrogen were being removed from the soil and the food and fiber and shipped hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. The soil was depleted, had to get guano from Peru and develop synthetic fertilizers to try to repair the soil to provide nutrients. And Marx took this not only as a metabolic rift, but he generalized it. And he saw this as kind of a structural characteristic of capitalism by which it created ecological crises. Marx actually wrote in Capital how the periodic development of epidemics was in itself a metabolic rift within capitalism. So this was really profound. It's even profound today in terms of being able to understand what's going on.
Absolutely, especially considering the COVID pandemic. Why do you think that it is that lots of people think Marx has nothing to say about nature and ecology? Where does that come from? Rosa
Luxemburg once wrote that Marx in his scientific creation had outstripped us as a party of fighters. And she said, look, the socialist movement tended to focus on what its immediate problems were and to ignore the larger science in Marx's analysis. And she said, as new problems arise, as some of these other problems come to the fore, the socialists will return to Marx's analysis. Marxism was very uneven in carrying this forward. George Lukács, when he wrote History and Class Consciousness, wrote this footnote 6. He questioned Engels's conception of the dialectics of nature. The whole Western Marxist tradition took on Lukács's footnote, the dialectics can't be applied to nature. When I took critical theory, that was the first thing they told us. As a result of that, we started to look at dialectics only in terms of society and human history, isolated from the natural world, which doesn't really work. So even though great works were produced in Western Marxism, they couldn't deal with ecological problems because they'd already written nature off and sort of given it off to natural science, which they declared was positivist.
I would have thought the existence of the Soviet Union, where in the name of Marxism, all sorts of ecological crimes were committed, has also something to do with that.
It was originally the leader in ecological thought in the world in the 1920s and early 30s, but the great ecological thinkers in the Soviet Union were all purged, most of them executed, which tends to hinder thinking, to say the least. And so after Stalin's death, the Soviet Union was the worst on environmental issues because they were introducing chemicals. They were involved in trying to create nuclear parity with the United States, and it became very ecologically destructive. And then there's a late Soviet ecology period. They had the biggest conservation movement organization in the world. They were led by scientists. They came back with dialectical conceptions and were really in a battle with the Soviet state at the time in the 1980s, where there was real progress being made or reversion away from the ecological destruction. There's really kind of three periods in Soviet history in that respect, but they started off as the ecological leaders in the world.
Yeah, nobody remembers that, do they?
Tina, can we just unpick some of that conversation a bit? Because I think that was really a bit of very dense theory, which is not something we're used to hearing, particularly when we're talking about the environment. This concept of metabolism, what do you think is meant by that in terms of the relationship to nature?
I think it's something very simple, is that humans engage with nature and nature engages back. Both of us change, so you change nature and nature has certain laws and the laws will fight back eventually, like as I described with the soil issue, and Marx wrote at length about that issue, which can be a bit dry, but it is actually, he did understand even 150 years ago roughly what happens when the laws of nature are being ignored, because capitalists thought they can just take this out of nature and that and put it elsewhere and feed the big cities with it, and of course things came crashing down. So that's what he called a metabolic rift. Something breaks, and that will lead to a big crisis, economic crisis. But he wrote at length about ecological crises too, which I found fascinating. And that interview was much longer, and I tried to really pack everything interesting in, but it was a bit dense. But it's a fascinating book. I really recommend comrades read it.
What I found really interesting was the fact that he spoke about a kind of a flaw in the thinking of Marxist theorists who'd sort of separated nature off.
Yes.
Just reminded me of this fundamental mistake within European philosophy, the kind of Cartesian stuff about the division between the mind and the body.
Absolutely.
And it's from these things that so many mistakes in terms of European thinking have stemmed. And what we see here, what is being pointed to here, is the fact that this mistake has been repeated by Marxists. And we don't understand, when we're talking about materialism and the importance of materialism, that actually what is being spoken about, just like with the dialectic, is also the surrounding environment. And for me, when I heard him say that, it was a real fundamental kind of opening up of understanding there to where we'd gone wrong in this, as socialists, as Marxists as well.
A lot of socialists still believe that nature cannot produce use value, that it's just the worker. The worker is everything. But when in fact, clearly, nature does produce use value, and companies make profit out of nature. Of course they do. But there's this sort of no, we've learned it like that, and we have to keep doing it like that. It's crazy. But yes, it shows limitations of much of the socialist left and the kind of education and things. We have to rethink everything and just don't just take everything for granted because you've been taught it.
Can I just say before we move on, I forgot to say it earlier, is that can I encourage people, if you can, to support us through Patreon? We're a very, very young program and we really do need some financial support. The link is in the chat. Somebody can put it there again. You can commit to giving us, kind of virtually any amount there. But we don't charge, if you've noticed, we don't charge for this program, but there are costs in making this program, and none of us are earning huge amounts of money either. So I thought I'd just pop that in there. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. We wanted to talk now to Michael Roberts, the Marxist economist, about how capitalism actually has created the climate catastrophe. I'm just going to share a little video quickly of Vox Pops we did about who is to blame? What do people think is to blame for the current situation and for the climate catastrophe?
No, obviously,
the rich. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they released more carbon dioxide in the past few decades than in all previous human history, didn't they? I don't think it's because we're using the heating at home.
It's total greenwash. It's what you do is you pretend it's being solved by people buying alternative products, that sort of thing, whereas actually that's not doing anything at all, or if it's doing anything at all, it's doing like that much. and we need this much.
I feel like the media, at least where I come from, they blame the poor. They blame the normal people like us, that we don't recycle, we don't take shorter showers.
Hello, Michael. Hi. I thought that little short clip was quite interesting. There were people who also said, I think capitalism is the problem. But I thought this idea, I can't have a baby or I can't have children, and we have to, I have to have solar panels on my roof, otherwise I'll destroy the planet. It's quite interesting. And we've heard how John Bellamy Foster, how he said scientists and science is being disregarded in this current crisis, really. And it's all about, capitalist companies trying to stay afloat, and things like carbon trading. I mean, that is madness, isn't it? What's going on there? How capitalism is trying to square a circle there.
Well, the solution, with the situation, as a risk of repeating what may have been said earlier in this particular session, the situation on climate change is now reaching, there is a point of no return. We've reached almost, and that unless something is done very quickly, we're in a serious situation which cannot be reversed. The UN leader, Antonio Guterres, was saying only recently the facts are undeniable. This is an abdication of leadership by all governments, and it's criminal that nothing is really being done to mitigate global warming and meet the targets, even the targets set by the governments at the recent Glasgow meeting. And the head of the International Programme for Climate Change, the scientific group of thousands of scientists come together to produce these reports regularly, are saying that the situation is now reached that any further delay, said the head of the working group, will mean that we'll have a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And yet, at the Glasgow meeting, the government set a target to reach to keep the global warming no higher than 1.5 degrees above the industrial levels we saw in the 19th century. And yet, according to the latest figures I've looked at, we are heading for a 2.7% centigrade increase in the next period. And unless something is done, we need to cut carbon emissions by up to 50% by the end of this decade. And currently, they're only falling only in some countries by 7%. So there's no way this is going to be met. And it's not just the level of carbon emissions, Tina, it's the stock of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. It's a stock problem because there are many gases, not just carbon dioxide, but nitrous oxide and others, which sit in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Methane for 12 years, nitrous oxide for over 100 years. And that means it's destroying the planet and heating up the planet continually, even if we reduce our emissions now to levels set by the Paris Agreement. And it makes me shudder to think that we go into this, we have the Ukraine war now, we have this energy crisis, we have this food crisis, and what's happening is a massive increase in all the fossil fuels, which supposedly we're supposed to be reducing in production. Coal power increased in Europe by 18% last year. Fossil fuel production, as we know, is rising fast. And really, we're still in the situation where 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and this is what is causing global warming and climate change and these emissions that cannot be controlled. And most of those emissions are coming out of the global north. Yes, I know China and India have big emissions, but compared to the populations they've got, they're really quite low per capita emissions. But the global south is what is going to suffer from this massive increase in warming up of the planet, which is just out of control. Just one other point I might make, Tina, that the military around the world is the single largest consumer of oil and therefore one of the top greenhouse gas emitters. The Pentagon consumes 59 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And if it was a nation state, it would be on its own, the US military would be the 47th largest emitter in the world, larger than Portugal, Sweden, and so on. And in that situation, nothing is being done to bring about a change in the situation, and we're heading towards a planetary disaster.
Technologically wise, could capitalism solve it? I mean, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars and build another world there and mess that one up. But could capitalism actually solve it if the political will was there, do you think?
Well, I think I put it the other way around. We do have the technological solutions. We do have those. It's not, well, yes, we can dramatically cut out and phase out fossil fuels. We also have new technologies which could begin to reduce the carbon emissions that are already stocked up in the atmosphere. We could be spending our resources and our efforts and investments on this. I mean, if we just matched the military spending that's going on in the world and placed it on the spending that we could do in these areas of developing these technologies, then we could drastically reduce the emissions globally. And we have to think globally. I agree with Alan. Everybody locally has got to organize to try and reverse this process and to give control to local democracy and communities to control over their energy and their food supplies and so on. But it's a global issue. Unless we take action globally, unless there's governments cooperating to achieve these aims on a global basis, then we cannot solve anything. The situation will continue to deteriorate, and local communities will only do a very limited effect on the impact that they can have. But we do have the technology. What we don't have is the public control of the fossil fuel industries, the big strategic industries, the banks that can finance the things that we need to do. We don't have control of those. People don't have control of those. Governments are not prepared to work in the direction of giving people control of those. And until we do, so it becomes a political issue. The technology is one thing, but without public ownership of the key areas, strategic areas of industry and finance, then we're not in position to practically do anything about the situation.
And of course, capitalism as a system has to expand. So they're actually doing the opposite still, even if they're trying to, put a little plaster on here or there. But capitalism, and that's why I find it difficult with, parties like the Green Party who will not even touch the issue of capitalism, because that is at the root of the current situation we are in, isn't it?
Well, I think as a Marxist and as a socialist, yes. I think everything leads back to the question of whether we can continue with this particular mode of production, where a small group of companies and the people who own them dominating the world make the political and investment decisions about our lives and organize and support whatever they want to do in terms of military action and so on. We have no control over that. And until that changes, until we're able to make that change, then we've now found it's not just a question of creating inequality, not just creating poverty, not just a question of excessive profits and waste of consumption, which takes place under capitalism, and continual and recurring crisis, but now actually threatens the destruction of the planet in terms of global warming and climate change. And as John Bellamy Foster has already pointed out, and as Marx pointed out on top, it's driving in the direction of destroying and degrading nature to an irreversible level. We're destroying, I say we, the small group of people that control our planet are destroying it.
Mm. So, I mean, we're wrapping up this program now, but in your view, I mean, capitalism is, Alan said, capitalism is destroying itself. It kind of is, but it could be going for some time in a downward spiral if we don't do anything about it. How can we get to a situation where we can change things around?
Well, I think as socialists, we know we need a global plan. We need public ownership. We need democratic control of the strategic industries and banks, and we need a global cooperation to achieve that. Now, you say, well, thanks very much, Michael, but what hope is there of achieving any of those things given the current governments that we have at the moment? Which only leads back to the question, which is, I presume, the point of such meetings and discussions we're having now, to organize politically in action to try and bring about those changes and not to give up. Let's not give up. We mustn't give up, because we're fighting for the survival of the planet and for 7 billion people and all the other species in the planet who are under our subjugation, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in Jackie and perhaps Alan as well, for maybe they have some final thoughts.
I have to say, I was feeling quite sort of, my mood was gradually going down. This is where it usually does when I'm talking about the climate, but actually to get that message yet again that what we've got to do is keep fighting, because we know we're right. And we know what we've got to do is wrest control from these people, however we do it. And it's a reminder to me as well about how quickly things can change. I know we've got little time, but things can change. I mean, that was my thoughts.
Yeah. Alan, do you have...
My response is that Michael nailed it, wrapped it all up for the evening, and that was great. But what we have to do is we have to occupy a space, let's say, that goes back to being a politics of we rather than a politics of me, and an economics of circularity in which we reclaim the virtues of putting back more than we take out. And all of that is possible. There are tons and tons of really exciting examples that are there around the world. If there are restrictions, I think we have to fundamentally be challenging the existence of deregulated markets, because that is currently the huge source of speculative transactions, whether it's food economics, energy economics, transport economics, whatever. That is where the casino is running amok. And so I think what we need to be pushing for is our own visions and what is within reach, inclusive reach of the communities that we're all a part of, but also insisting that there has to be a new level of leadership, nationally and internationally, and a planet that, you know, produced the Mandelas, that produced the visionaries, can do so again. They're probably going to come from James's generation, but we have to insist that there is a bigger alternative, a better alternative to the paucity of what currently passes for political leadership. And you can find that in the everydayness of small examples that could be written large across the whole of the planet in an inclusive and sustainable way. We just have to do it.
Thank you, Alan. I was just going to say one thing as well. When James was talking earlier about the paradigm shift and things can change quickly, just a little reminder that a few weeks before the Russian Revolution, Lenin was telling anybody who would listen that he probably won't be alive when the Russian Revolution happens. And bam, it happened like that. Things can sometimes turn, you know, quantity builds up and then sometimes quality really quickly changes. So we'll have to remember positive examples like that, I think.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of the show now, but just a couple of things. Don't forget, please support us on Patreon. And just one more thing about Jerome's work with the hunter-gatherers. He once spoke to me about this word, and it, you know, Alan has reminded me of this, which is what they use for their community, which is we, which is a mixture between me and we. It's we, and we need to get that we-ness going. And of course, we know that there is only one solution, really, and that is a revolutionary one. And I'm going to tell you about the next show, which, again, we're quite excited about. It's called Back to the Future, Starmer and the Resurrection of Blair. We're going to have a lot of fun on that program, I promise you. So please come back in 2 weeks' time and just hang on a minute, because we're going to have a rousing chorus to remind us about what the solution is, Tina, aren't we?
We do. She's great. Watch this.
Revolution is the only solution. 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 Revolution is the only